idea that as human beings we can't have children because of climate change. It's down to us to sort climate change, not the 1%. If there is a problem with climate change, and I personally don't agree with that, sorry. The 1% should bloody well sort it out. It's their problem, they created it, not us. Why should women lose their rights to have children? This is ridiculous. This is eugenics, people. Extinction Rebellion has been pushing eugenics. And we have other groups as well, and I'm going to speak about those. Another one that's been here in this square is Black Lives Matter. Now, Black Lives Matter, and I've talked to lots of people in the black community in London who don't like Black Lives Matter at all. But Black Lives Matter are another campaign group that are pushing this idea that the family should be broken down. So we should remove families, and we should remove this idea of having children in families. Now these things link up with these eugenic ideas I'm talking about.
Hi everybody, my name's Tony Gosling. I'm a journalist. I was here in Oxford for quite a while back in the 1990s working with Mr. Montbiot down Cowley Road on the good old, remember the old, if anyone remembers the Land is Ours campaign, we used to do mass squatting and things like that. But I'm not really with Debbie when it comes to criticising Extinction Rebellion or Black Lives Matter too much, because I think we all should be really basically sticking up for everyone else's right to protest. And I think in a way the establishment rather likes it when different protest movements are kind of having a go at each other, battling away at each other. So I do kind of, I mean, obviously there's a lot of money involved in Black Lives Matter, much of which comes from a woman called Leah Hunt Hendricks, who is the granddaughter of H.L. Hunt, who was one of the people who conspired to assassinate John F. Kennedy. He's one of these massive oil magnates. And so it's interesting, isn't it, that that family would be funding Black Lives Matter, whilst they were also, by the way, involved in creating and funding the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. So we're looking at a sort of elite that like to play both sides of the chessboard. That's what I would say, anyway. So just a basic sort of intro. I did work for the BBC back in the 1990s, early 90s, for 3.5 years, and working also in Broadcasting House. But I think that training for me was mainly a training about what I didn't know, because it was fascinating to see the way that broadcasting is used to tell people what the rich and powerful want them to hear, and to create a sort of illusion of, oh, well, we've got a free press in this country. There's a tremendous amount of stuff which is just simply put in the bin on the cutting room floor. And that's why I like doing live TV and radio, because sometimes unexpected things can happen and you suddenly see people cut off in the middle of a sentence when they're saying something that they aren't really supposed to say. Anyway, I think that much of this policy has been to do with this is the reaction to the very real virus that was around in March and April, has been an attempt to destroy civil liberties. And it's been used as an excuse. Never let a good opportunity like that go to waste. The media has been absolutely appalling. I don't know if people have seen the fact that there's been massive censorship of doctors. Massive censorship of doctors. Why would we be wanting to do that at BBC Towers and ITV Towers and CNN Towers? Why would they want to stop doctors from giving us a second opinion? So there's an official story, but these doctors out there, who many of us have been to in the past, they're actually there for a very good purpose. That is because we know that sometimes the doctors get it wrong, or also the doctors are in the pay and in the thrall of the pharmaceutical companies. So I think that's one of the big scandals of this whole pandemic is the censorship of the doctors. Some of them, of course, are rather nutty, but particularly those that say there was no virus, and I can't quite believe there are doctors still out there that's saying that. This is a sort of David Ickeist area that Ike likes to get it. He injected this in about April time. There was no virus. Viruses don't exist, this sort of thing. So there are one or two like that, but the really, really best doctor I've come across is a bloke called Dr. Mike Yeadon. Now, if anyone's heard of him, He used to be one of the bosses of Pfizer, and he was also their chief scientific advisor of these people who've... is it actually raining? No. Okay, we'll come outside a bit. I was getting rained on by the gazebo there. Again, right, okay, I was chancing my arm. Anyway, so Mike Yeadon is an absolute superstar in all of this, and every time he puts up advice about this on YouTube, somebody somewhere reports him, and guess what? He's censored, he's taken down. So why is that happening? It's because there is a very narrow debate allowed within the mainstream press of what's going on here. And it's interesting, having worked in the mainstream, to see how they operate. There's some actually very creepy characters behind the cameras and the producers, etc., that you will never see because they sit in the galleries and the TV galleries and the producers. There's also people within broadcasting who are trying to do a decent job. So, I'd like to say something about Pfizer, since this is Pfizer's big week, isn't it? They've managed to get their vaccine approved. It's now being put into little old ladies, who, by the way, there was no trials of this vaccine on the elderly who were in long-term care or the frail. No trials at all. So really these people that we're seeing on the TV are unwitting guinea pigs. They don't know. They don't have the time like I do to look into these things. And Pfizer's track record. This is a company that's been around for a while, isn't it? What's their track record? Who are these people? What have they done in the past? Well, if we go back to around about 2000, Pfizer did some trials of a vaccine in Africa for, guess what, meningitis, right? So they thought, oh, let's try this out on a few Africans and see what happens. Now, that's not really the way that vaccine trials should be done. Anyway, this Pfizer vaccine led to brain damage in children, paralysis in children, slurred speech in children. It was called Truvan, T-R-O-U-A-N, and it's maimed hundreds and hundreds of kids. In fact, almost a majority of those who this vaccine was trialled on had side effects. So this was a live human trial that Pfizer were doing out in the jungle somewhere, out in the middle of nowhere, where I hope nobody would notice. Well, anyway, some of the locals did notice, and there were some non-corrupt officials, and I forgot for some reason to write down what country it's. I think it was in Congo or somewhere like that this took place. But anyway, WikiLeaks, good old WikiLeaks, a couple of years ago released a lot of the correspondence to do with this trial. And they found out that Pfizer had set aside £35 million in this trial to just deal with whatever the consequences would be, right? So 35 million quid just sitting there either, and they used that money to pay private investigators to dig dirt on the public prosecutors in the country, and they used the other part of the 35 million, the other half, to pay about £100,000 in compensation to all of the families that have been injured, and that used up the whole of the 35 million. So what they're doing, these companies, is they're setting aside large amounts of money in the knowledge that their vaccines that they're trying out will harm people. This is the company that we now trust, apparently, to deal with COVID. The swine flu vaccine, back in the 1980s, £60 million was paid in compensation for that, and there were hundreds of deaths and injuries due to that vaccine. Not due to the swine flu, due to the vaccine. So this is what the way these people operate is they have a big contingency fund with every new vaccine to pay for either bribing officials or else paying compensation to victims in the hope that they will finally somehow get their vaccine approved, and then they'll be on the magic money tree, and lots of people will then be able to pay them for their trouble. Anyway, so as a journalist, I am absolutely staggered in the number of big lies that we've seen in this pandemic. So big lie number one, I think, has been that you don't get any immunity. So, you know, this is one of the things that happened right at the very start. Everyone was told, no immunity. Remember that? No immunity. So you can catch it again and again and again. Well, that's just a lie. A lie. It's a lie. Because lots of people, something like 30% of people who first came across COVID back in, say, March or April, were already immune. Because they had a previous coronavirus which matches the same type of coronavirus as this is. And this has all come out now in tests, but you know what? You get one line in one newspaper and then it's forgotten about. And the way this is happening is very much like the September the 11th attacks, I think, in that we're getting a cascade of lies at the start, and slowly but surely the truth comes out, but it hardly gets recognised. The other lie is that the vaccine is going to be a solution. Now, how many times have we heard that on the TV, or the radio, or in the newspapers? The vaccine is the great solution. In fact, I was laughing, listening on Tuesday when they said, oh, and Matt Hancock is almost crying. Oh, at last, the vaccine's here. Is the vaccine going to make any difference to anything else other than the profits of Pfizer and the dreams of Bill Gates? I really don't think it is going to make a difference, because there is an enormous amount of evidence that these new mRNA vaccines have extremely bad side effects, and that they would be trialling these mRNA vaccines like the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines for the last 15 years, and they never got them approved. Because the authorities in Britain and America, in their wisdom, said, well, actually, this looks really dangerous because it could cause autoimmune disorders. If you're going in and altering the genes of a person's cells, those genes might hang around, and those cells might hang around, they might multiply, and in fact, we've seen evidence in the past in animal trials and all sorts of these, that what happens is the mRNA vaccines go into the organs of the body. They go into the organs of the body and they stay there, and they sit there, and those genes then multiply, those cells multiply, and you have potentially permanent autoimmune disease. So it was quite interesting on Wednesday to hear a sort of alarmed thing on the BBC News. I think it was like 8 o'clock in the morning or something, saying, anyone with a real history of autoimmune disease, please think twice about taking the vaccine. But that's the day after they announced that this was going to be some sort of wonder cure, you know, galloping over the horizon. Okay, the other big lie is a story that hasn't been discussed by the mainstream, I don't think, at all, which is whether or not this is a bioweapon. Is it genetically engineered itself? Is the vaccine a bioweapon? Well, this is an obvious thing to be asking, especially since apparently it's been released by China over in Wuhan. Was it a biological weapon that they were playing with or not? We want to know. Or was it someone else playing with it who released it in China? But no questions asked at all about this. Apart from Richard Dearlove, the ex-boss of MI6, who snuck it out in August saying, we believe it could be a bioweapon. Right, well, and then it's forgotten about. The reason is that people are being told, oh, there is no virus, is because if you start to look into it, you'll see the evidence right early on was that, yes, it is a bioweapon, and it is basically, if you think about Dr. Evil and his needle, what would they be doing? Right, they'll find the most contagious disease, the common cold, the coronavirus, and then they pin on a few nasties on it and stick it out into the population. And that's, of course, what we've seen. The New Delhi University, last week in January, brainstormed this in India, and they put out a report saying that this has got a SARS and an AIDS spike protein on it, this coronavirus, and it's very unlikely it would have occurred naturally. So they're academics, they're being quite subtle, they're telling us there, this is a bioweapon. It almost certainly is. And there was this whole thing to do with gain-of-function research, if anyone's heard about that, which is where they try and get a nasty virus to go from one species to another. This was going on in Fort Detrick, which is America's Portendown, and then it was sent over to Wuhan to do this research in Wuhan by the Pentagon, because they weren't allowed to do it in the United States anymore. I think the evidence is the jury is out, but the evidence is that this definitely looks like a bioweapon. The other big lie is that the cure has been worse than the disease. The cure is supposedly stopping all activity, not seeing your loved ones. Now, how many elderly people have died from broken hearts in our care homes because of what's happened, this inhuman activity? You're not allowed to touch them. They're not allowed to touch you, even if they want to, if they want to risk it, if they think it's worth it. They're not allowed to touch anyone. And yet you've got care workers going in and out of these care homes every single day. This is an attempt to destroy those close, loving ties within the family. And I think that it's absolutely appalling that they've now come up now with this wonderful test that was supposed to be rolled out for Christmas. What was it called? A lateral flow test, which is going to allow us back into our care homes, because we can stand outside the care home, have a test, and then we're told, hey, wonderful folks, you have no COVID, you can go and see your loved one and hug them and everything. But no. This is a sort of spiritual war between these two tests. The old PCR test, which brings up loads of false positives, so everyone's got it when they haven't. And they're saying now the lateral flow test is, what is it? It's supposed to be, doesn't pick up all those ones that the PCR test picks up. Well, it's not picking up those stupid false positive tests, is it? That's the only problem with it. So let's get rid of the PCR test and let's bring in the lateral flow test. Let's do a bit of science, please, science editor of the BBC, and allow people a sensible test so they can see their loved ones over Christmas. I think absolutely appalling to have destroyed people in that way. Mike Yeadon says 5% false positives, but the trouble is lots of people who have no symptoms are being tested. And if you don't have any symptoms and you're tested, the chances are you've already had the virus, possibly months ago, but you've still got a few bits sticking up your nose, bits of dead virus. They find those and they say, oh, you're positive. Actually, very unlikely that you really are these days. Just as an anecdote, a friend of mine was contacted by Test and Trace and told to go and take a PCR test. He lives in West London and he was told to drive up to North Wales to take a PCR test. Oh. Right. I mean, is this harassment? It just seems harassment to me. This is just a few weeks ago. So you know what he said? I hope there are no children listening. You know what he said? Stop that. And he went to his local test centre, 15 minutes drive away. He went into the test centre, drove in, and there was no customers at all. Why did they send him up to North Wales? And they said to him, have you got an appointment? And he said, no. And they said, oh, that's okay. Just write your name here and give us your phone number. Did the test in 10 minutes, and 2 days later, we got a text back from them saying, negative, you haven't got it. And you know what he swears by? He swears by vitamin C every day, high dose. Vitamin D every day, high dose, or whatever, normal dose. And zinc, that's right, thank you. Zinc, this is almost like a quiz, isn't it? And omega fish oil, one of those little pills every day during any kind of pandemic, gives your immune system that energy it needs to fight anything that comes along. Now, I'm not going to say it's the only thing to cure, but this is what the government should have been saying right from the start. The TV should have been saying right from the start, is that we need to give our immune systems the opportunity to fight this thing. It's like your immune system is like a machine gun, and all those vitamins are like the little bullets by the side. So when the virus comes along, your machine gun is full of loads of bullets. You can just destroy the thing as it rolls into your body, right? So they should have been saying that. Why haven't they been saying that? Our own immune systems are able to cope. And the reason they haven't been saying it is because, you know what? Vaccines make a lot of money. If you can get a vaccine out there, and also if you can get rid of people's civil liberties and con them into getting rid of them voluntarily, then you're going to get a big pat on the back from the likes of Henry Kissinger, Klaus Schwab, and Bill Gates. Well done. Well done, guys. Well done. So, We've also got a chumocracy in this country. Have you noticed that? How Boris and his mates, and we were just hearing about Stanley Johnson, right? Look at him, he's in the middle of an enormous web of powerful people who want to use our political system to make money for themselves and power for themselves. The chumocracy is unbelievable. £1.5 billion of these contracts, which is roughly half of the contracts, have gone to Tory donors or Tory members. So the idea is, and there was a big splash in the Mail about it yesterday. We've had people making an absolute fortune out of this. They were tipped off last year. I heard anecdotally yesterday, somebody I know in Gloucestershire was tipped off last year. Get ready for PPE supplies, and you might find you make a lot of money. He made a fortune out of it, and in fact he's just sold his house and bought a farm in Gloucestershire because of all the money he made, and he's an ex-Tory councillor out of the pandemic. So the chumocracy is absolutely appalling. It's really just a way of conning the public and then making your mates get a lot of money, so you get a lot of cachet. These people are like Bond villains, aren't they? They're sort of sitting in there, right, what can we do to make more money and to make everybody do as we say? They're power hungry. Another one of these chums is a guy called George Pascoe Watson. He is from Portland Communications, and he was in on the policy-making decisions at the Department for Health right from the very start of the pandemic. He is Portland Communications, and he's the boss. Is the biggest recipient of money from the pharmaceutical industry, and he kept that secret, the fact that he was in on those ministerial phone calls right the way through the pandemic. He was advising Matt Hancock what to do, and he's paid by nobody else but the pharmaceutical industry to do that. Not only that, he kept his presence completely secret from the public and from journalists. That he wasn't supposed to be there. That came out about 3 weeks ago, that he was in on all those calls. George Pascoe Watson, another member of the chumocracy. Around about 30% of us had natural immunity to COVID. So that's something I mentioned earlier. Very untruthful of the government to then say that nobody has immunity. No, 30% of us did have immunity. There's also around about 10% of us that have antibodies, and a 20% also have T-cell immunity. So when they're doing the antibody tests, right, it doesn't really tell you anything, because when you've got rid of the disease, the antibody levels go right down quite quickly. But if the disease comes along again, your T cells start producing antibodies immediately. So the antibody test is not reliable, like the PCR test. This is science, the science that you're not seeing and hearing on the BBC. They say, don't they, and the ministers do, we follow the science. They don't follow the science. So also, I think... Okay, so I've talked a lot about the science, maybe too much, but so what is going on? What is going on? Why is this all happening? So we have a global policy on health. That's important, right? The World Health Organization is the UN's health body, and it has been driving this all around the world. We heard from Belarus that the IMF offered the Belarus president $1 billion to have a lockdown. Belarus president said, no thanks, they didn't have a lockdown. They've been absolutely pilloried in the press for it. But this is what I think is going on, is you've got this World Health Organization policy alongside basically bribes to national governments in order to have lockdowns. This is the activity of an international mafia. That's what it is, an international organized crime mafia. You got a question?
Yeah, what's the evidence of that conspiracy?
It's all, have a look online. It's true, it's true. He is declared, just because you don't see it on the BBC doesn't mean to say it's not true.
No.
He himself, the Belarus president, has said maybe he's lying. There's lots of politicians that do lie. But there is evidence out there on various websites, news sites, that will show you.
From the mainstream media. Why should I take my news from a man with a microphone on the street.
No, you're taking your news from the national media in Belarus. I'm asking you, sir, I'm asking you to take your news from the national media in Belarus and Russia, etc. So it's reported in Russia. Can I just give you an example as to why? I don't think this chap really wants to know the answer. Anyway, let's carry on. So the Belarus people didn't have a lockdown, and if you have a look at their curve of the effect of the virus in Belarus, it's virtually identical to here, which does rather beg the question that do lockdowns actually do anything useful whatever? That's the question. And I think there is increasing evidence that the opposite is true, that more people are dying from, in various ways, from the cure, so-called cure, than the disease. Okay, so let's just look at some of the other things that have been going on internationally. So who is the World Health Organization? Right, well, the guy that runs it isn't a doctor. He's a former politician in Ethiopia. And what's happening in Ethiopia now is that you've got a civil war going on, very much like is going on in Yemen. So we've got the beginnings of another Yemen going on in Ethiopia. So he got out just in time to become director of the World Health Organization. The whole point of this is to look at who is running who. Who is running who? Well, last September there was a partnership agreement signed between the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and the World Economic Forum. Effectively, the United Nations for years has been saying we're not getting enough money and we can't do our job. So what happened last September was the World Economic Forum signed an agreement with the United Nations to do a partnership. Now, this isn't really a partnership, is it? If you think about it, the UN has got no money. The World Economic Forum in Switzerland has got bags and bags and bags of cash. They're awash with it. And if they haven't got enough, they press a button and they make up another trillion. So these are the guys who are now in the driving seat at the United Nations. And who is the major funder of the World Health Organization? Bill Gates! Bill Gates is now the main funder. So what's happened is the international health policy, which is driving all of this, has been privatised. Privatised. Remember Mrs. Thatcher, all the wonderful things she did for our railways and our buses and our electricity and our water and our gas and our telecoms. Privatised. It's a private international policy run by the World Economic Forum and the World Health Organization and Bill Gates. So why now? Why is it happening now? That's another good question, isn't it? We don't really hear much in the mainstream. The reason it's happening now, I think, is one word. The one word the international elite and the Bilderbergers and people like this do not like to hear. One word. Brexit. 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 Because they have been working for many, many decades to create something called the United States of Europe, which, by the way, they don't like to call it that, the United States of Europe. And it is effectively a system that is so perverse you would never, ever, ever dream it up. So what happens in Brussels? Can I have a bit of water, please, or something? Do you mind? Pass my water. In Brussels, the way the system works in their marvellous United States of Europe, thank you very much, is very simple. When we elect a politician, we like them to be in charge. When we get rid of a politician, we don't want to see them again. We don't want to see them ever again. People like Theresa May. Actually, she wasn't de-elected by us, she was de-elected by the Tories. But we don't want to see them keep popping back. Well, that's what Brussels does. It finds these failed politicians that we've got rid of and it puts them in charge of the whole show. So, for example, Neil Kinnock, who was a failure as a leader of the Labour Party, never won anything. Oh, he gets promoted and put in charge of the European Commission. He's or not in charge, but he became a European Commissioner. Leon Britton, under Thatcher, who was accused of child sexual abuse. In fact, I spoke to a journalist called Tim Tate, who lives in, I think he's in Gloucestershire or Wiltshire somewhere, and he spoke to the customs officer that found child pornography in Leon Britton's boot of his car as he was driving across the channel. It was all hushed up and covered up, and so what happened is he was moved out of the Tory party. This is when the MP Geoffrey Dickens was looking into all this stuff. He was moved out of the government and he became a EU commissioner. For someone whose credibility is zero, they then put them all in charge. Now, this is a terrible, perverse system. It means that whatever happens, the bad politicians always win. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why this has happened now. Because Brexit is the biggest problem these people have ever had to cope with. Now, I met some Bilderbergers back in 2016, face-to-face, at a Bilderberg meeting. These people are effectively the secret rulers. They'd love to wander around Bonn Square now because they know no one will recognise them. They're the most powerful people. For example, the funder of Obama and Hillary Clinton's election campaign from Goldman Sachs, he loves to wander around because he knows nobody knows who he is. He's never on the television. There's no scrutiny of him by the press because he always declines interviews. And so people like him, when you say the word Brexit back in 2016 to them, they hated it. You can see the hairs on the back of their neck stand up. They turn around on their heels and march off in the opposite direction. They hate the whole idea of it. But what they're hating is not just the idea of Brexit, it's also the idea of democracy. They do not want us being in charge of who runs our country. They think that they are better placed to decide who's in charge. And those people, of course, are going to be making sure that the wheels are oiled for them. Look at, for example, 2 massive contract frauds going on right now in this country, which they've set up. One is HS2. HS2 is totally unnecessary. It's just a contract fraud. Someone's drawn up a marvellous idea of what they really love to do, and then some idiot in the government has signed it and said, yeah, we'll do that. So this is fraudulent. There's no proper competition and there's no proper look for whether we need it or not. The other thing is happening not far from me at Hinkley Point, not far from me in Bristol, and that is the Hinkley Power Station. The whole thing is unnecessary, and they're probably never going to build it, finally build it, because it's a contract fraud. That's what these people want. They want us to be paying for their dreams, and that actually means that they will be running the show. Anyway, I better wind up now. But I'm absolutely up for any questions if people want afterwards. If you've got any questions, you can ask them in a moment. So, also, I think a very important thing to talk about, I know Debbie was talking about the Nazis. This is absolutely up for discussion now, because what's going on over in France right now is absolutely horrendous targeting of Muslims. They're bringing in a new law in France, Macron is bringing in a new law in France, which is going to target Muslims specifically. All mosques have to register, all sermons given in the mosque, or whatever they call them, they have to be recorded and sent into a central place. They are absolutely cracking down on Islam. In France now, in a very similar way to Hitler did in 1933, 1934, the beginnings of Hitler's targeting of the Jews in Nazi Germany. And also, we've seen, haven't we, these cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad and taking the mickey out of Islam in France. What's happened is the government has said, oh, this is all about freedom of speech. We must allow these cartoons taking the mickey out of Islam. It's very important. Well, what if those cartoons were taking the mickey out of Jews? What if those cartoons were having a go at Jews? Would we accept that? No. So what's happening in France now, and Macron, by the way, is a former employee of the Rothschild Bank who came out of absolutely nowhere to become president of France. So the French are having to suffer this, and it's all very convenient that the yellow vest protests all got shut down because of COVID. So,
what's behind them?
Sorry?
With the Muslims. What's actually...
Well, okay, so Muslim Islamic terror is something, by the way, that started in Afghanistan back in the 1980s, something called Operation Cyclone. And you know who started it? the Central Intelligence Agency, because they employed a whole load of hothead Muslims to attack the Russians in Afghanistan. And so from that point on, I mean, the ideology was put together by, and we know the ideology behind this Islamist terror is from Saudi Arabia. Our staunch allies are paying for this, and then they're educating these radical imams, and they're importing them into the United States and into France. So they're basically running it like a cult, the Muslim terror organization, and then they're giving them guns. By the way, the Russians have stopped a cult over there recently. It's called the Jehovah's Witnesses. Does anyone know the Jehovah's Witnesses are a cult? If soon as you join the Jehovah's Witnesses, you cut off all contact with anyone that's not a Jehovah's Witness. That's how cults operate. And I think we need to be aware of that. The Russians under Putin have now completely stopped any activities of the JWs over there. So if you ever see a JW in the street here, just have a quiet word with them and say, you do realise you're in a cult, don't you? Because they are not allowed, for example, it's Sunday, isn't it? We can talk about this sort of thing on a Sunday. They're not allowed to have the bread and the wine from the Last Supper of Jesus. No, no, no. Only the elite Freemasons that run the Jehovah's Witnesses are allowed to have the bread and the wine. You're not allowed to have it. Anyway, so I think I probably better wind up there. I do a weekly radio programme in Bristol, which is streamed now. I got booted off FM by my spineless manager at a community radio station. Because we were saying, would you believe, we were saying, just as we were booted off the air, that it was dangerous for people to be sent into care homes from hospital without being tested. That week we were told, you're no longer on FM. That's how perverse this system is, and they're using the media to hoodwink and brainwash as many people as they can. Now, I just hope that things are going to be better when we don't have to cope with the global elite, mainly the people I've looked into who seem to be behind most of this. And you know, there are 10 of them, the Bilderbergs, there are 10 of them involved around the world that we've identified, including, of course, Henry Kissinger. The most sinister Bilderberger involved in all of this is a woman called Emmanuelle Charpentier. She runs what's called the CRISPR gene editing laboratory. She got given loads of money by hedge funds to develop all sorts of new techniques of editing human genes. And I met her face to face over in Dresden in 2016. And I said to her, your gene editing technology is amazing, madam. And she smiled. I said, yes, it is, isn't it? She's got a massive laboratory, because she was surprised that I even knew who she was in this art gallery in Dresden. And then I said, well, yes, but what about the designer babies? Because that's what they're doing too with this technology. And she turned on her heel and she signalled to the security to come between me and her in this art gallery. I didn't even know the security were there. These guys appeared from nowhere and just walked in between me and her. Now, I'm not going to punch her. I'm not going to attack her in any way, but I am going to ask her questions about why she thinks it's a good idea to have designer babies, that where you can pick and choose what characteristic of your children you want. Anyway, I think I'll finish it there, and if you want to hear our radio show, you can pick it up 5 till 8 every Friday evening at thisweek.org.uk. My name's Tony Gosling. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Woman you just mentioned, was she one of the
Thank you.
two recipients of the Nobel Prize for Chemistry this year?
Yes, she was. Emmanuelle was a recipient of the Nobel Prize. Thank you very much, sir. Isn't it good when people pay attention? Isn't it good? Because most people think, oh, that's the journalist's job. They'll be looking after that for us. Yeah, right. And it's actually people's... I mean, they play on people's laziness. They play on people's fact that they don't have the time to look into these things. We do science. Any more questions or any more points people might make?
Yeah, the teacher about a month ago now, who had a lesson in France about the European tradition of free speech, lampooning traditions. He had a lesson. He told his class that there were going to be pictures of the Prophet, and if they didn't want to participate, they could leave.
Good question.
He did his lesson, in which all he did was state the traditions of Western European people. And at the end of the class, his head was chopped off by an 18-year-old Muslim man who I believe who had just been given asylum from one of the countries, I'm not quite sure which one it was. My question to you is seriously, if a teacher in Europe can't teach the traditions of Europe without having his head removed from his body, what else would you expect Mr. Macron and the like to do? Because surely the traditions of Europe should be taught in safety without having your head removed.
Well, I don't think anyone is saying that people should have their heads chopped off. I would say two things in reply to that. Is that the intelligence services have been using mentally ill people and recruiting them to do things like this for many, many years. And if people are vulnerable, I even had personal experience of a guy who was mentally ill, who they tried to recruit, and even one of my fellow presenters on the community radio station in Bristol, the intelligence services tried to recruit him by bribing him and by blackmailing him. He refused to play ball. The other thing to say about your attacker is that he was reported by Muslims to the French intelligence services on their intelligence danger hotline 3 times before he committed those atrocities. And the same, by the way, happened here with our terrorist attacks in 2017. Are you turning me down?
Did you do the talk again then?
Oh, okay. He didn't turn anything down. We had 3 terrorist attacks in London in 2017. We had, one in Manchester and 2 in London. All of those, the main people in all those 3 attacks have been reported to the anti-terrorist hotlines. So what's happening is the problem is in the security services. It's not in the police. I would suggest anybody who has suspicions about anybody being some sort of plant, possibly planning something, they go to the local police. Whatever you do, speak to the anti-terror hotlines. So I'm not condoning what that guy did, obviously I'm not. But these things can be orchestrated. These events can be orchestrated through, dare I say, hypnosis, mind control, and picking up vulnerable Muslims, vulnerable Christians or whoever, vulnerable anybody, and getting them to follow this weird Saudi idea of the Wahhabists, of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So this is a toxic idea. Now, you've touched on a fascinating point here, and that is that our religions are not necessarily what they seem. Is a Jew a Jew? Is a Christian a Christian? And is a Muslim a Muslim? Because we have official versions of these which are based on the Quran and based on the teachings in the Quran and the Bible, and we also have what you would call Gnostic versions or occult versions. So for example, Zionism is a occult or Gnostic version of Judaism. There are many Orthodox rabbis that totally disagree with the existence of the State of Israel on a biblical basis. We have the same in Christianity. I just mentioned the Jehovah's Witnesses. Is a cult a Christian organisation? No. A cult is not Christianity is not a cult. And I can say that as a Christian myself. But the same is true with Islam, is we've got these fake versions, basically fake versions of Islam, which are used to enthuse people. For example, the 9/11 hijackers, these guys, as I really, raise a fantastic point. These guys, the 9/11 hijackers, were boozing and snorting cocaine in the weeks before the attacks. So are they Muslims? No. Anybody can call themselves a Christian or a Muslim.
They left their Qurans behind.
They left the Quran behind. So anyone can call themselves something, that doesn't mean to say they are. So we need to be distinguishing between people who are honestly believing in what they're saying and someone who's coming in as an interloper. The obvious great examples are Bush and Blair, who both said they were Christians and then started an illegal war which has killed roughly 1 million people. And they're still, by the way, walking the streets. And I saw yesterday Tony Blair has put out his proposals as to how to have a kind of permanent lockdown situation in the whole of Europe. And he's also a special Middle East advisor, wasn't he, for the quartet? So after starting an illegal war, Tony Blair then gets made a special peace envoy to the Middle East. How perverse can you get? And the guy says he's a Christian. He's not. I would suggest he's working with the intelligence services because he was infiltrating CND and all these left-wing groups as a young man. And so Blair was just pretending. And you know what those people are? They are nihilists. Nihilism means you don't actually believe in anything apart from the goal you want. They're not even vaguely believable. Anyway, does anyone want to take the microphone off me here? Or any more questions? Any more questions?
Just to run on from that a little bit, I wonder what your views were that this is, in a wider sense, an attack on our spirituality. Whether it's shutting down the churches of any sort of denomination, or people just like to go out into nature, find God through communicating with nature.
Okay, well, look, is it an attack on our spirituality? Of course. I did a presentation last Sunday, this time last week, to a eschatology roundtable, which was organised by a Muslim think tank in London, and I entitled it Biological, Economic, Psychological and Spiritual Warfare. So it's what they call, like, basically the idea now is that you have a multipolar war. So it's going on all sorts of different fronts at once, so people don't know what's going on. They think they've got to grips with it, and then something hits them from behind. This is a form of psychological warfare, but obviously economic warfare, we've seen that. Many people going out of business. The psychological side of it is largely through the media. What was the other one? I think the spiritual side is in a way the most important, because what's happening is it's bringing out all sorts of, what is your real beliefs? The problem, of course, for many is that even within their own marriage, they may have great differences of opinion. This was very similar to the whole the reaction to the 9/11 attacks, but now it's much more pronounced. Families having big rows over Christmas about who's going to go and see who, and who's allowed to come in to see somebody else. Well, the fact is, you don't need to ask anybody else what to do. You will follow the law. I'm not saying don't follow the law, but when the law is an ass, then you have to be prepared to break it. As this movement was, and the stand-up groups were, and Debbie and others were, back during the Halloween lockdown, because it started on Halloween, so I just called it the Halloween lockdown. And people were prepared to break the rules, and basically the police could not cope. And so I think the police then went back to central government and said, this is just crazy. Although, of course, it was a lovely exercise for them. But spiritual warfare, definitely. And the idea, I think, is to keep tuned to your spirituality, whatever it is, and don't be diverted by what you see on the BBC, etc., because they really are trying to send you down a rabbit hole. And I was just listening to the news coming in here, going on about Brexit again and again. They've been saying the same thing for the last 4 years. Oh no, the talks have broken down. Look, at the end of the day, they are telling us what they want us to hear, not what we need to hear. But you will hear a bit of that investigative journalism on my show, which I'll plug again at thisweek.org.uk every week. Just a bit of news. You know, you're not going to hear on the BBC or anywhere else in the whole of the West. Does anyone remember the top Iranian nuclear scientist who was killed last weekend, not this weekend, weekend before? He's the number one in the in Iran's nuclear program, which might or might not be nuclear, depending on your point of view. But I'm not here to say one way or the other. I would be surprised if they didn't have any nuclear weapons, because you know the Soviet Union was in a state of freefall for several years, where their nukes were sitting around guarded by soldiers that hadn't been paid for years. And so if anyone came along with enough cash, they could drive an SS-20 rocket launcher out of the door in Ukraine and drive it wherever they wanted. So I would be surprised if they didn't, actually. But anyhow, that being the case, this guy was assassinated last weekend. Thursday last week, the Turkish press, the Syrian press, the Lebanese press, but none of our press has reported a senior Mossad officer was assassinated in Tel Aviv. And there's pictures of it in the street, and a car with machine gun bullets all down the side of it. But we're not hearing anything about that on the news here, are we? Actually, what needs to happen is an assassination like well, by the way, Soleimani, he was their general from the Revolutionary Guard of Iran. When he was assassinated back in January by the Americans, about 2 weeks later, a plane crashed in Afghanistan. And the guy in the plane was the CIA's main guy for Iran. And he died. So I think what's going on here is the Iranians, they don't need to put it on the news. The only people that need to know are those people close to the intelligence services that are arranging these assassinations. They will know, oh, my mate got assassinated last week in Tel Aviv. A lot of this stuff is just simply not on the news. So go and have a look on it if you can. I think it was on New Eastern Outlook. There's an article about it in English. But the original stuff was all in Lebanon, and it's in Syria, and it's in Turkey. The Turks are quite good because they're kind of halfway. They hate the Russians and they hate us too, because we tried to kill their leader a few years ago. So anyway, just be aware there's lots and lots of very important news, but we're not getting any more. Thank you. And that's quite good news in a way, because it means there's less likely to be a war. So if the Israelis can assassinate and the Americans can assassinate Iranians with impunity, eventually they'll do more and more and there will be a war. But if the Iranians are assassinating people back in the opposite direction, it's less likely that our kids will have to suffer another world war. So thank you very much for listening, everybody. Any more questions? No? Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks.